not only did the Power of the Jedi era give us some really great classic trilogy figures, it also gave us some really great classic trilogy vehicles. And one that actually stands out, especially for its packaging execution, is the Imperial Atsta and Speeder Bike. This was cool because we got a really awesome tri-window box, which, yeah, compare that to what's going on today at Hasbro with the elimination of, packaged windows. This was pretty significant. And, flipping it around, you got the full piece count. We got an Atsta, a speeder bike, and a furry little teddy bear to ride on that speeder bike. Oh, and by the way, if you're asking why I called an Atsta, it's because, well, if you're going to call the big four-legged one an AT-AT or an AT-AT, well, then this must be an Atsta. So, yeah, let's call it an Atsta. Why not? Now, the Atsta was obviously released in the original vintage line, the Kenner line back in the day, and was re-released multiple times in the modern line, the very first one being in the Power of the Force 2 era, where it was packed with no figures, but it did show a Stormtrooper could fit inside, because, why not? Stormtroopers go inside of everything if they're not busy smacking their heads on Death Star walls. This version of the Atsta, however, was going to include a pack-in figure, and that's why I purchased it, because I am a completist when it comes to original trilogy basic figures, 3 3/4. And it's why I was able to pass on other versions of the Atsta that came out later on, because, well, if it didn't have an original pack-in figure, I kind of didn't need it. I do like Star Wars vehicles. I'm not saying I'm against them. It's just, not my bag, baby. I also don't have space to display all of them. I mean, I have a few, and I actually really do like the Chicken Walker. Let's call it the Chicken Walker instead of the Atsta. How about that? Or the Scout Walker. See, look at so many names. The original vintage one from Kenner was able to be re-released in the modern line because Paploo, which was the South American distributor for Kenner product, had kept the molds. Kenner didn't have the molds anymore, but these molds were transferred to Hasbro for the modern line because tooling up vehicles is expensive, and having access to these Paploo tools is what allowed so many of the original vehicles to get re-released in Power of the Force 2 and Power of the Jedi. The best version, I think, of the Chicken Walker, okay, I'm going to go back to calling it the Atsta again just to annoy people, was this version of the Battle of Endor from Target. I thought it was really awesome because not only did you get an Atsta, but you got a speeder bike and you got giant logs. I mean, come on, giant logs! Okay, well, it wasn't just about the logs. There were some, original repaint figures included in the set, which, again, why I needed to purchase it. But the Atsta went to my daughter's school as a donation, like with most of the vehicles I owned before my move from California to North Carolina. Getting an Atsta driver, however, was not available in Power of the Force 2 until the green carded versions, and we got updated versions throughout the line, including this vintage collection one, which was an homage to the original Kenner version, which was the Endor. Now, speaking of Endor, there's someone else that should be discussed, and that's Ewoks, even though they're never mentioned on screen, yet we all know they're Ewoks. Crazy, right? Just like Tatooine. All right, so this was a two-pack of vehicles. You got your Chicken Walker and you got your speeder bike. And this particular speeder bike came with the Ewok-flavored version of a driver. It's the same speeder bike that we'd already gotten in Power of the Force 2, which, again, was a re-release of the original tool, thanks to Palace Toys. And we got this in Power of the Force 2 in several flavors. We got the Imperial Scout Trooper version, and then this was re-released in a Princess Leia version, and then finally in a Luke Skywalker version. But we never got the Ewok version. In fact, there's never been a single-carded version of just a Ewok on a speeder, even though this clearly does happen in the movie and in my nightmares. So, yes, although there is a very toyetic aspect of having a teddy bear driving a flying motorcycle, for some reason we've just never gotten a sort of single release of this, outside of things like the Titanium series. And Ewoks in general had a very light release in the Power of the Force 2 and Power of the Jedi line. For the longest time, all we had was this one, which was Logray and Wicket W. Warwick. Eventually, we got a flying Ewok from a deleted scene. That's not the flying Ewok from the movie. That's a second flying Ewok that was deleted, but that's a YouTube video for another time. But again, very, very few Ewoks released early in what I refer to as the modern line, starting in 95. Eventually, this self-corrected itself, and we have a lot of Ewoks. All of the vintage ones have now been redone, as well as several others, including even a baby Ewok that was packed in as an accessory. But in the beginning, not so much. It was a very, very light Ewok affair, and a very, very slow burn to get your Ewok collection. In fact, the only other one we got in Power of the Jedi was this guy Tebow that we'll be covering in the next episode because we're going in release order, and that's a YouTube video for next time. This version we're talking about is the one that came with the Imperial Atsta and speeder bike, and even though it didn't have an Atsta driver, we did get a speeder bike driver in the form of Paploo. So let's talk about Paploo, because he is an interesting Ewok all on his own. So the Ewok we're talking about is this guy with the red feather that falls down, pronounced Paploo, not that hard to pronounce, not like Animanimam. And you may remember having him if you owned toys in the 1980s. He was the lighter colored brown Ewok, again with that red feather coming down. But the interesting thing is all the Paploo releases on card backs with a photo don't feature Paploo. Look, no red feather. Not on this one, and certainly not on the Vintage Collection one, which reused the photo from the original Vintage line. So, yeah, that's not Paploo in any of those photos. That's a different Ewok entirely. It's like a different way of flying. That's this guy, Ramba. So somehow Ramba's photo got used on every Paploo figure, both the original one from Kenner and the modern one from Hasbro. Now, there was a Ramba figure done with his own photo, so his photo got used on two different Ewok figures, which is, again, kind of weird. The only Paploo figure we ever got that actually had a image of Paploo on the card was this one, but that was a drawing, not a photo, and obviously doesn't count as a vintage carded release. But hey, it was always great to get a new Paploo, and in fact, we've gotten many, many Paploos over the modern line. Actually, 3. These 2, and then the one that we're talking about today with the pack-in Power of the Jedi vehicle. Now, this was a Kit Bash figure. It used parts from the original Power of the Force 2 Ewok 2-pack, and then gave him a new head to make sure it was Paploo and not Ramba, and certainly not Logray or Wicket. So, yay, more Ewoks. Eventually, many, many more Ewoks. But at the time, yeah, it was like a Ewok drought. We had so few in the beginning. So it was a welcome addition to get a new one, even though it was mostly a reuse of parts. But most of the Ewoks in the modern line have been reuse of parts, as opposed to the vintage line, which every Ewok was a fully new sculpt, which was awesome. But, I guess when you have to save money. But it's interesting because with Ewoks being literally created to sell merchandise, it's ironic how few we got in the modern line for the first several years. But eventually, an Ewok army there would be.